Let's use a real example
Okay.
of what you're talking about. I think you're exactly right, Doug. When we've done talks out in the world at conferences and so forth, we've sometimes told the story of Gillian Lynn, and this is told so well by Sir Ken Robinson, who has a lot to say about education. And you know, he describes the story of an 8-year-old girl, and she was struggling in school. She was late often. She tested poorly. She disrupted the class. She was always fidgeting and daydreaming, and she was always being corrected by her teacher. And this behavior kept going on. And the school ends up writing a letter to Jillian's parents and said, you know, she needs to undergo an evaluation for learning disabilities. She most likely has something, and she has special needs that need to be remedied. And this story takes place in the 1930s, so this is before the epidemic of ADD, ADHD, that type of thing.
Right.
Okay, so her mother took Jillian to a psychologist, and she was brought into this large wood-paneled office, and she was asked to sit across the room from the psychologist and the mother, and she sat on this big leather chair, and the psychologist for several seconds just watched her. And that seems like it'd be a little awkward, but he had a reason for this. And he began asking the mother several questions, and always out of the corner of his eye, he was aware of what was happening with Jillian while the questions were asked. And after a while, the psychologist stood up and he said, you know, Jillian, I need to talk with your mother. Would you excuse me for a moment? And so the doctor and the mother got up and started vacating the office, leaving Jillian there on the leather chair. Well, as he was walking out, he flipped on the radio. He flipped the switch on the radio that was on his desk right near the door, and they exited. Well, he's talking to her mother outside, and after a few minutes, he knew something was going on. He just knew. And so he said, come here. And they looked in through the glass into the room where the daughter was, and she was no longer seated. She was standing, and she was dancing. And this doctor looked at the mother and said, Mrs. Lynn, your daughter is not sick. She's a dancer. She needs to be with students like her in an arts academy or in a school that, you know, supports that type of activity, and take her to dance school. Well, the mother was very excited because, keep in mind, for the first time, maybe ever, you know, a person in authority said, you know, your daughter's not sick. She's well. Things are okay.
Right.
She may have a gift. And so the mother did exactly what the doctor had suggested and got her enrolled in a dance school. And later on, Jillian said, she said, I can't tell you how wonderful it was. I walked into this room and it was full of people like me. People who couldn't sit still. People who had to move to think. And you know, her skills ended up growing immensely as a dancer. And she ultimately joined the Royal Ballet Company and had the opportunity to perform all over the world. And she ended up later in life becoming a choreographer. I bet you've heard of the productions Cats.
Oh, really?
And The Phantom of the Opera.
Yes.
Well, Gillian Lynn was the chief choreographer for those productions. And you know, some of the greatest Broadway, you know, musicals ever.
Right.
And I think that really gets at what we're talking about today, Doug.
Well, I absolutely. I mean, I think that's a wonderful story, and it did take place in a time in which schools and our learning institutions were not quite as sophisticated in being able to assess students as we are today. But you need to understand that we still are challenged in that whole concept of birthright gifts and discovering and becoming, because our schools, for the most part, are based upon qualitative and quantitative learning. And we don't address the other way, the multiple intelligences. And we know that Jillian is an example of that student that just blossomed and grew. And I would hope that people in our audience understand that one of the things that we want to make sure that occurs is that we all are responsible for those people we care deeply about, especially our children, that on becoming, we need to identify what are those elements or triggers or possibilities in them that we encourage. And I have several grandchildren. And one of the things that I know is that I have four, 2 boys, 2 girls. They're absolutely wonderful, and of course they're the best kids in the world, as you well know that I'm going to say that. But they all learn differently, and fortunately, my sons and their wives are astute enough to pick up on that, and they picked up on that early, and they've addressed those, and it has helped with learning overall. And I would hope that if nothing else comes out of this particular show, is that people understand that we've got to be patient, because on becoming is a process.
It is. It is definitely a process, and I hope that the parents and the teachers and people that are in positions of influence with children, since you brought up children, I hope that they're able to provide that space for that self-discovery, and also to help create the context for the discovery of those IntelliKeys or those birthright gifts, those unique attributes that make that person, unlike anyone else.
That's right.
I really do.
Right.
Well, we're going to talk about the Personal Owner's Manual. We've got about 10 minutes, 12 minutes left. And, this is something this concept and this activity that we'll talk about is something that's been done in a variety of contexts. You and I have done some work with this with students, college students in the first year experience.
Right.
This has been done with at-risk teens. I've used this with teens in boot camp type experiences. It's been used in churches, and it's been used with the military and with executives. A variety of contexts, and almost always the same results. This concept first appeared in print in 2006 when I published an article in a journal called Growth, which was an academic journal. And this is something that it's sort of an inductive exercise that's done, and as we said before, it could be used in any stage of life or in one's profession.
Right.
Well, let me tell you another story, but this one is about me. It was 3 a.m. and I awakened and I was really thirsty. And I thought back for a second to the fact that I had several slices of salty pizza the night before, and I realized I needed to get a glass of water. So I pushed the blankets aside, got up, walked to the kitchen, and got myself some water and kind of closed my eye for a moment, and just was very satisfied as I drank the water. And for whatever reason, I was sort of bordering on the edge of lucidity at that time. I looked down at the table, the kitchen table, and it was an empty box, and next to it was a instructional manual for a cell phone. Well, you know me, and you know how much I like technology.
Right.
And you also know that rarely do I ever open up an instructional manual for electronics, because I usually am pretty good at figuring
You're intuitive.
Yeah, usually. And I had one of those weird compulsions at that moment to pick that up and start looking through it at 3 a.m. 3 a.m. I think it's one of those things you would only do at 3 a.m. And I began scanning through it. And I had a really, really weird thought as I looked at it. I looked at the table of contents, and I looked at some of the content, that followed. And I thought, almost for every product that exists, there is an owner's manual or an instructional manual. This is how it works. This is what it does. What if people had an owner's manual? What would that look like? What if I had a personal owner's manual? What would the content describe? What would it say about me? And then, if I had that information, what if I followed it? What would my life look like? How might it be different? And that's what brings us to this activity today. We have actually created a personal owner's manual. This is just something that was produced for us, but this is something that's been used in a variety of contexts, as we talked about before. This personal owner's manual has a table of contents, and as I think back to that instructional manual that I saw on the table, there were several headings. Some of them were the following: overview and introduction, okay, distinguishing features, requirements for optimal functioning, precautions, and then support. So I think we should have a little bit of fun and look at some of these headings and kind of think of them within the context of the person, of the college student, of the high school student, of the business executive that's too busy to ever take time to sit down and have, to rest and to think and ponder, some of these concepts that we've been talking about today.